St. Vincent de Paul said, "Mortification is the ABC of spiritual life. Whoever cannot control himself in this will hardly be able to conquer temptations more difficult to handle." Saints of old practiced what we would consider bizarre penances. St. Thomas More wore a hair shirt under his clothing. In a painting, St. Rose of Lima wore a thick silver circlet with spikes on the inside, like a crown of thorns. Scourging oneself or sleeping on a plank of wood instead of a bed was also a common way to practice penance. But these days, these sort of penances are not practiced as often, or at all. And if they are practiced, it is under the supervision of a spiritual director. For those of us, which would be most of us, who don't want to sleep on a plank of wood, or wear a crown of thorns, or scourge ourselves, there is a much better way to practice penance and self-mortification, and that is simply to deny our own will. And seeing how we all tend to prefer things to go our own way, these opportunities can be endless. Although St. Therese didn't practice any severe penances, she practiced small mortifications, such as never resting her back against the back of her chair, learning to do without a lantern for a month when a sister forgot to return it, or sleeping with only a light sheet when she had the coldest cell in the convent. These days especially, it's easy to want our comforts. Fasting, even for a day, can be very trying when our bodies are used to sipping on a sugary coffee or tea, or constantly eating small snacks. The saints are wonderful examples of how to practice a little self-denial and mortification. The following little stories are some examples of how we can imitate the saints. Most saints fasted regularly. St. John Vianney fasted eating only boiled potatoes. St. Aloysius Gonzaga had to force himself to eat more than he usually wanted to. St. Brendan of Ireland lived on a vegetarian diet only and didn't eat until 3 in the afternoon. St. Severinus of Noricum never ate until after sunset. St. John Bosco would share his lunch with schoolmates who had little to eat, letting them have all the good things, and he would eat whatever was left. Sometimes it's easy to fall into a cranky mood and stay there. Working on being cheerful despite a sour mood is another way to practice penance. St. Apollo, the 4th century abbot, was known for his cheerfulness, and he insisted that his monks remain cheerful and joyful even while they were doing penance, because he believed that joy is the fruit of charity and is necessary to maintain our spiritual fervor. St. Francis de Sales claimed that the devil likes to see us sad and melancholy. Therefore, choosing to be happy can represent a rejection of the devil and be an act of faith in God. Talking too much or participating in gossip is an easy fault to fall into, especially on social media. Practicing restraint in the comments or choosing to scroll by instead of giving idle judgmental remarks is a good way to practice self-improvement and mortification. Because Blessed Peter of Siena knew that one of his worst faults was chattiness, he disciplined himself by the habit of silence, but it took him 14 years to achieve this goal. Newly beatified Carlo Acutis also admitted one of his weaknesses was talking too much, a fault he worked on often. On the other end of the spectrum, working on talking less and listening more is something most of us need to work on. St. Arsenius once said, "I have often been sorry for having spoken, but never for having held my tongue." St. Peregrine spent 30 years practicing silence, and Blessed Helen of Udine took a vow of perpetual silence and only spoke on Christmas night each year. Being patient through the suffering of an illness can be a form of penance. As St. Paul of the Cross said, "What beautiful virtues can be practiced in sickness! Love of humiliation, helplessness, gratitude, and gentleness of heart toward those who take care of you. Blind obedience to the doctors and nurses. Keep your countenance cheerful and remain in bed as on the cross of the Savior. Love to suffer those pains and fevers as the Lord sends them." St. John Birchmans used humor to handle some of the irritating remedies used by the doctor, which was bathing vinegar wine on his forehead. The saint jokingly remarked, "It's a good thing I haven't long to live. I can't afford such an expensive disease." Working to guard our tongue against the inclination of impatience and choosing instead to respond with patience is a very good way of practicing mortification. St. Therese worked on patience every time she was interrupted while writing her autobiography. She said she sometimes only got about 10 minutes of writing done at a time with all the interruptions, but she mortified herself with patience and a smile. St. Faustina, as well, never let her writing in her diary play a part in her self-will. When she was interrupted or the bell would ring for prayers or work, she mortified herself by immediately putting down her pen and would continue her writing later. St. Therese, being tired out from her illness, experienced some irritation with a sister who was ministering to her on her deathbed. After having been corrected for this, instead of being discouraged, Therese exclaimed, "Oh, how happy I am to see myself imperfect and to be in need of God's mercy so much, even at the moment of my death." St. Rita practiced much patience with her irreligious and verbally abusive husband, as well as St. Jane de Chantal with her very opinionated father-in-law. St. Francis de Sales said, "Suffer and offer up those trifling injuries, those petty inconveniences that daily befall you. This toothache, this headache, this cold, this contempt, or that scorn. All these small sacrifices, being accepted and embraced with love, are highly pleasing to the divine goodness, who for a single cup of water has promised a sea of perfect bliss for his faithful." Working against our pride is another way of practicing self-mortification. The natural way to work on your pride is to practice humility. St. Joseph Calazans established an order in the 17th century, but at one point he was demoted within his order. He endured this and other difficulties without complaint. St. John Leonardi had a similar problem involving the religious order that he established. During a time of difficulty, he stayed with his friend St. Philip Neri, who gave him a very important responsibility, caring for his cat. Working on bad habits like swearing or using God's name in vain is a natural way to practice mortification and self-denial. St. Thais, a former prostitute, spent years doing penance for her sinful life. She would not even allow herself to say the name of God, feeling unworthy. Instead, when she would pray, she would say, "O thou who hast created me, have mercy on me." Last, there is always the weather that can help us practice some penance. St. Aloysius Gazanga once made an interesting observation. Putting up with the cold of winter and summer's heat is, of all mortifications or sacrifices, especially pleasing to God. First, because the cold and heat come from the hand of God himself, and second, because the sacrifice is more hidden in comparison, for instance, to fasting, and thus likely to be less motivated by pride. There are many ways to practice self-mortification and self-denial. It's simply practicing virtue rather than sin. Lucky for us, with our many weaknesses and faults, the list of opportunities to work on ourselves and practice self-mortification and penance is endless.